Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be really getting into the weeds today with the February jobs report and what it all might mean for where the economy is headed. We're going to be pulling most of our info from this pretty interesting CBS News article I saw. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy some of the stuff we dig into, like, for example, we'll be breaking down layoff trends. We've got those pretty big government job cuts that everyone's talking about. And of course, no deep dive on the jobs report would be complete without trying to figure out how this might change the Fed's mind about interest rates.
Yeah, definitely a lot of moving parts here, right? It's
Mm.
kind of like we've got all these puzzle pieces, and the real challenge is, understanding how they all fit together to give us the complete picture.
Exactly. So let's start putting some of these pieces together then. I guess the best place to start is with those headline numbers everyone saw. They added 151,000 jobs in February, which, I mean, on the surface doesn't sound terrible, but economists were actually predicting something closer to 160,000. And to make matters a little worse, unemployment actually ticked up just slightly to 4.1%. So
Yeah.
when you saw these numbers for the first time, what really stood out to you?
Honestly, I think what kind of stuck out to me the most was just the fact that we missed the forecast. I mean, granted, it wasn't a huge miss by any means,
Yeah.
but especially with prices going up like they have been recently, inflation and all.
Yeah.
I think it starts to make you wonder if maybe businesses are starting to hesitate a little when it comes to hiring new people. I mean, their costs are going up, so it makes sense, right? But if that's the case, then it could be a sign that the labor market is maybe starting to slow down a little.
You know, that's a really good point. We've got this potential slowdown on the horizon. But then on the other hand, the report also showed a pretty big jump in layoffs, right? Like a really big jump, actually. Something like a 245% increase compared to January. And that's actually the highest it's been since way back in 2020. I mean, doesn't that kind of seem like a pretty big contradiction when you consider how many jobs they added?
Well, it definitely shows why it's important to not get too focused on those top line numbers.
Yeah.
The ones that make the headlines. I mean, it's always possible that some of that increase.
Yeah.
It's just normal.
Yeah.
Some industries always lay off more people at certain times of the year just because of the nature of the business.
Yeah.
But yeah, even after you factor that in, I mean, it's still a pretty big increase. And I think it's worth looking into a little deeper to see what's really going on there.
Totally agree. And it looks like if you dig a little deeper, one of the main reasons for that big jump in layoffs was Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE is what most people call it. What's the deal there?
Well, yeah, DOGE made a bunch of cuts in February. And there's no question those cuts played a big part in the overall increase in layoffs. It's pretty crazy to think about, right? How like a single organization can have such a noticeable impact on those national employment numbers.
It really is. So, okay, we've got this jump in private sector layoffs, uh, partly driven by those DOGE cuts. But what about the government? I know the report mentioned something about federal jobs declining by like 10,000 in February, right?
Yeah, that's right. And this is actually where things start to get a little bit more complicated. See, it takes a while for all the numbers to get reported, especially when it comes to the federal government.
Yeah.
So it's entirely possible that what we're seeing in this particular report, it might not be the whole picture yet when it comes to government layoffs. In other words, that 10,000 figure, it could actually be a lot higher once all the data is in. It could just be the tip of the iceberg, which kind of brings us to like the big question hanging over everything. You know, what does this jobs report mean for the Federal Reserve?
Oh, yeah, right. The Fed. They're the ones who get to decide about interest rates and stuff. They've actually been cutting rates for a while now. But they hit pause back in January because, well, everyone was worried about inflation getting out of control. So how does this jobs report with, good news and bad news both?
Yeah.
How does that play into what they're going to do?
Well, yeah, that's the big mystery, isn't it? It's a tough spot they're in. I mean, on the one hand, you've got inflation, and everyone's worried it's going to keep going up. But then on the other hand, you've got this, possible slowdown we were talking about.
Well, it's like a tug of war. Inflation's pulling in one direction, slowing economy's pulling in the other,
hmm
and the Fed's stuck in the middle just trying to keep everything balanced.
Exactly. And this jobs report, it doesn't really give them a clear answer one way or the other. I mean, some economists are saying it might actually make them more likely to start cutting rates again.
Mm-hmm.
Their thinking is that the economy needs a little help right now to keep things moving.
Makes sense. So it's like they want to boost the economy, but they also don't want to send prices through the roof. It's a tricky situation for sure. I actually saw a quote in the CBS article from Lindsay Rosner. She's the head of multi-sector fixed income investing at Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Anyway, she said, quote, "The report justifies the momentum that's been building for a resumption in the Fed's cutting cycle."
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. But it's important to remember that not everyone agrees on the best way to handle this. Right? It's not as easy as just saying cut rates or don't cut rates. I mean, there's always going to be different opinions and experts arguing with each other.
I guess that makes sense. The article also quoted Joe Gafolio, who's the CEO of Mutual of America Capital Management, and he was saying that he thinks there are a bunch of indicators that are pointing towards a possible slowdown in employment growth. He specifically mentioned things like hiring intentions and temporary staffing levels, things like that.
Right? And those are definitely worth keeping an eye on. But it's interesting how different experts can look at the same information and come to completely different conclusions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It just goes to show that economics is not like an exact science the way physics or chemistry is. I mean, you're dealing with people and how they behave.
Yeah.
And these big complex systems. So it's always going to be hard to predict exactly what's going to happen.
I guess that's true for pretty much anything involving people, right?
Okay, so let's take a step back for a second here. I feel like we've thrown a lot of information at the listener so far. If we had to boil it all down, what would you say are the big takeaways from this jobs report?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's a really mixed bag. I mean, we're still seeing job growth, which is good,
Right.
even if it's not as much as we saw before. But then on the other hand, we've also got this huge increase in layoffs,
Mm.
which is at least partly because of all those government cuts.
Yeah, and how that all plays out over the next few months,
Yeah.
both for the Fed and for the economy as a whole.
Well, nobody knows for sure. Yeah, definitely a lot of uncertainty in the air right now. It's kind of like a transition period we're in, and it's hard to say for sure what's going to happen next.
Okay, so with all that in mind, I kind of want to shift gears for a minute and talk about what this all means for, everyday people. It's easy to get caught up in all these big economic numbers, but ultimately, this stuff affects people's lives. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These trends we're seeing in the job market, I mean, they can have a huge impact on everything. You know, which industries are doing well and which ones are struggling, how easy it is to find a job or get a promotion,
Yeah.
even how much money you have at the end of the month to pay your bills.
Yeah, it all comes down to that in the end, doesn't it? So let's say you're someone who's out there right now looking for a new job.
Uh-huh.
What advice would you give them, especially considering how uncertain things seem to be with the economy and everything?
That's a good question, honestly. I think the most important thing right now is to really do your homework, you know. Make sure you understand which industries are doing well and which ones might be more likely to lay people off if things slow down. And don't be afraid to, talk to people, network, reach out to folks in your field, and get a sense of what's really happening out there.
So it's all about being proactive and being smart about how you're looking for a job. Don't just send your resume out to everyone, right?
Right, exactly. And even if you're not actively looking for a new job right now, I think it's still a good idea to stay informed about what's happening. Read the news, follow some economic blogs, whatever works for you. Just make sure you're aware of the big trends that could affect your industry.
That makes sense. I guess it's kind of like the old saying, forewarned is forearmed.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about people who are worried about losing their jobs? They've got a job right now, but with everything going on, they're a little nervous about whether they'll still have it in a few months. What advice would you give them?
I think it's important to remember that your career, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Don't freak out just because of one jobs report or a couple of scary headlines you see on the news. Instead, I would say focus on things you can control, like learning new skills, building your network, and just generally making yourself more valuable.
Yeah.
The more valuable you are, the less likely you are to get laid off, no matter what's happening in the economy.
I like that. Focus on what you can control. That's
Oh.
good advice.
That's great advice. I mean, it's easy to feel like you don't have any control when you hear about all this economic stuff.
Yeah.
But really, you have more control over your own career than you might think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it all goes back to that thing we were talking about before, what was it called? The Fed's cutting cycle or something.
Yeah, the Fed's cutting cycle.
Right. That
Yeah.
sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. Basically, it just means that the Federal Reserve, they lower interest rates to try to, give the economy a little boost.
Right, so it's like when things start to slow down, they try to make it easier for people to borrow money and spend money, and hopefully that'll get things moving again.
Exactly.
But like we were saying, it's not always that simple. I mean, sometimes if you cut rates too much, it can actually make inflation worse.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to walk this fine line between stimulating the economy, but
Mm.
also not letting inflation get completely out of control.
It's a tough job, for sure.
And another thing to keep in mind is that when they change interest rates, it doesn't always have an immediate effect. Sometimes it takes a while for those changes to actually, trickle down and make a difference.
Which is why it's so important to pay attention to these trends and try to understand what's happening.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, this jobs report, it's just one little snapshot in time. The economy is always changing, so you got to keep up with it.
Hmm.
Exactly. What might be true today could be totally different tomorrow. So it's not enough to just, know the numbers. You also have to understand, how the whole system works
Hmm.
and what kinds of things might cause it to change direction in the future.
So it's like you need to develop this sort of economic literacy, right?
Exactly. And that's why stuff like this CBS article we've been talking about, it's so useful. It's a good starting point, but it also makes you think and ask questions. And hopefully it encourages you to do your own research and form your own opinions.
Totally. Don't just take our word for it, or anyone else's for that matter.
Right.
Read different things, look at the data yourself.
Exactly. And most importantly, think about how all this stuff connects to your own life. Ask yourself, how could these changes in the economy affect my personal finances or my career goals or even my investments?
That's such a great point. We've talked a lot about how this jobs report could affect different industries. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to how it affects you personally. And remember, this is an ongoing conversation.
Uh-huh.
The economy's always changing, so you got to stay curious and keep learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. We've talked a lot about the potential downsides of a slowing economy. But, maybe there are some good things that could come out of it too. Like maybe it'll force businesses to be more innovative, or maybe it'll create new opportunities for entrepreneurs, or maybe it'll even make people rethink their priorities and focus on what's really important. It's something to think about anyway. So until next time, keep on learning and keep on diving deep.